All right, so previously we got our timer working here, but now we want to start tying in this graphical element that we have created. Now, if you remember, we talked about the fill amount here, and it's a value that runs anywhere from 0 to 1, and that's what we're going to want to control in our script. So let's pop back over to Visual Studio to get that started. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to first address our if statements here. These did work perfectly fine, and you can keep these, and you might have to do a little bit of refinagling, but we're actually going to switch these around just a little bit, because it's going to be easier when we start working with our fractions that we're going to have to deal with to keep this where the timer value is actually greater than 0. So we're actually going to switch these around so these are greater than 0. And we're going to keep the code that we had. So I'm actually going to add a new set of brackets here and add in a else. And so do the same thing here. I'm going to get new curly brackets, hit enter, go down, hit enter, and add in an else. And that just separates this out. So we still have our code function. Like if we were to run this, this would still function the way we'd expect it to, except now we want this to only work these other things for what we're about to do. And that's going to require us, of course, to have a little bit of math. And so what we're going to do, we want to come in here and create some variables. Now, we can, of course, create this is a public method. So for example, I could create a public float, and I could call this like the fill value, or we can of course create accessor methods that could allow us to do this. Now we have seen accessor methods before. These are what we also call our get methods, which if you recall we did right here when we had our strings. And so these are a great way for us to help get private values. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and I want to create a private, I'm going to call this a float, and I'm going to call this the fill value. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to then create a method that's going to allow me to get that. I'm going to go ahead and collapse update here just because I won't need that right now. And I'm going to go ahead and create a public. And since this is a float, I want to, of course, return a float value here. And we'll call this get. This is our fill value, so we'll call this get fill value. And all this is going to do is just return fill value. And so now anytime that we want to use this value will be here, and it keeps it restricted. Now we could do the same thing here with our bool, and that would be something I'm going to challenge you to do off camera, to go through and change this reference here. But for now, I'm just going to leave it in here. But I'm going to challenge you to off screen, go ahead and update that so that we have a accessor method, because again, this is a better practice here to use this way because it restricts the privacy of your variables. Now we think about what this fill value needs to be. Well, what we want this to be is a value that's being updated, right? Because it's going to be called within this update timer, and we want that to be eventually constant update. So it's always going to be a fraction, right? I've already said we got to do a little bit of math here. And so what is that going to be divided? Well, we have two numbers that we're going to work with. We, of course, have our timer value, and we're going to divide that by the time to answer the question. You see, Visual Studio is helping me out here. And so that is a great way for us to do that. And I might think, well, how does it work? Well, if you think about timer value is, of course, this float that we're defining here. And the time to answer the question is the total amount. So, for example, if our timer value is, let's say, at 30, then we have 30 out of 30, that's 1, which would give us the full circle that we're wanting to have. If this value was now, let's say, 15, and we had 30 seconds set up here, then that means we should have half of that circle remaining. Now we can actually just copy this here, and we're actually going to go ahead and bring that on down to this other if statement. But we don't want this to be the time to answer question. We want this to be the time to review our answer, because remember, these are two different things here. Now let's test this out here just a little bit by going down in here to our debug log. And since we have a couple of different things we're keeping track of, such as is answering question, let's go ahead and add that in here. And I'm going to just, I want this in one statement, so I'm going to put this in here. And how I'm going to separate this is I'm actually going to do a plus, and then I'm do quote, and I can just put a space in there, or I can do like colon, just so you have something to identify it. And you can see we still have an error here, so I'm going to put another plus here. And what this has done, this is called concatenation, allows me to kind of put values in here so that I can just kind of separate them out. I'm going to actually then do the same thing over here. And I want to put in my other thing, which let's say, what is the other thing we're keeping track of, which of course is our fill value. And so now if we have those in here, and let's save this, we should be able to see what that state is, the timer value, which of course we've seen before, and what our fill value currently is at. And let's give that a quick test here. So we go ahead and run that. And we can see it immediately starts outputting. I'm just going to go ahead and pause the game. And you can see we have a state here. We have true. We have our countdown here. So we can see this is, immediately starting right away and giving us some answers. And of course we have our fill value. You can see how that's also being affected. So I'm just going to scroll that cursor back up there, right to the top here. So we're starting at 5 because if we look at our thing, it's probably still set at 5. We didn't change that timer value here. You can see it's still set to 5, so you can see it sets to 5. It's starting at 0, so that's the initial, and then you can see immediately is jumping right to 1. All right, but that allows us to get some indication of how this is working, and you can see how those values are changing. You can see this value right here, of course, is steadily counting down, as is the other value, that is our timer here. So again, very cool how we can see all of those values are actually working. And of course, that true value, which means that's the state that we are in for is it answerable. All right, so now back over in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and do the next component. So we need to add another public variable in here. So we're adding another public bool. And again, you can convert these later. That's going to be your challenge here to change these variables over into access methods. And I already gave you one of how to do it. And we want this one to represent whether or not we can load the next question. So we're going to say load next question. And we're going to assume that one is true. And remember, by default, these bools are set or assumed to be true. So you could put equals true here if you want, but by default this is assumed to be true unless you explicitly tag it otherwise. And so let's go ahead and head down into our else statement here. So this is of course saying that we have a else and an else, which means this is our if you think about how this logic is working, we're not answering a question, right? And so it's set to false, and we're going to this secondary else, which means that our timer has now fallen below 0. So we are going to have to take the same variable, which is the load next question, and we want to set this one back to true because we want to, at this point, reinitialize this state here. So we could just say load next question and have it be there, but without it having the equals, this will not explicitly say make sure that this is a true value. Now, one more thing we need our timer script to do before we do anything else is we have to think about what if the player clicks on a question and they're ready to lock that question, but there's still 15 seconds left on that timer. Do they have to sit there for 15 seconds? No, we want to wait for that timer to stop. So we're actually going to come up here. I'm going to go right after my update method, and I'm going to go ahead and add in a public method and make this void. And I'm just going to call this to cancel the timer. All right, or you can even call it stop timer. Would be, I guess, a better one. Now this one should be a pretty easy method for you to do. So how do we do this? How do we stop the timer? Well, what is the variable that's keeping track of that time? Well, if you think about it, we have this value called timer value right here. So we can actually just use timer value. And all we're going to do is set that equal to 0. And that should, of course, because it's 0, it's no longer running within that value. Because now it's not going to do anything. It's going to stop. Now this is not implemented yet in our code, but we now have set the message for us to be able to go ahead and call it. And the reason why we made this public is we may want other scripts to be able to access this versus the other ones which are private. We don't want those other scripts to have access to those because those are going to exist simply within the timer. Now, as I already mentioned, we haven't really connected these pieces all yet back in together, but this is a good stopping point right here before we start connecting those different pieces. A parting challenge I do want to leave you with, I'm not going to show you how to do it because again I gave you an example, is go ahead and change these two bools here from public variables into private variables and create the appropriate accessor methods for them.